Okay. So we have Evan Nardone. Is that how that's pronounced? Okay. Uh, Kevin McGrill and Garrett Bryden,
Bradlyn.
Bradlyn. Sorry.
It's all good.
Uh, did you guys want to introduce yourself, or do you want me to read the intros you sent me? I could go either way.
Introduce from there.
Okay. Okay. So Evan Nardone is an experienced LOT subject matter expert, implementation specialist, and corporate strategist. He is a chief technology officer at Saint Mortiz Security Service, where he supports security program solutions through technology initiatives to increase customer service and operational efficiency. Kevin McGrill, or Cam, as he is better known, is principal evangelist for Ditto, where he helps organizations securely migrate, modernize, and maximize their use of the cloud. He is a Google Workspace top contributor, developer expert, and ambassador, as well as member expert in the U.S. Marine Corps Cyber Auxiliary. Cam enjoys working with open source software and is a proud member of the Apache Software Foundation. He has battled spammers for decades, and his research projects hundreds of millions of internet users every day. Cam is also...
Oh, dear God, I wrote that much?
Yeah. This is the last line, though, so we're
okay, good.
Cam is also a Center for Innovative Technology Mach 37 Cybersecurity Incubator graduate and a member of the board of advisors for Virtue.com and SecurityUniversity.edu. Garrett is the director of technology and operations at BizTech, where he brings his decade-plus experience in architecting and implementing bespoke solutions for financial firms, local governments, and law enforcement to bear for clients in West Virginia and beyond. Garrett believes that technology only works when it works for you, and that by educating users and providing approachable, robust solutions, that you can empower organizations and their people. And now I'm going to turn it over to those people.
Thanks, Nathan. So we just kind of wanted to talk about, smart cities and, some of the more modern approaches and some of the results that people have had with that. The city of Columbus about 5 years ago was selected for a $50 million grant to try out a lot of, smart city technologies. And they just actually released their final report a couple of weeks ago. And a lot of what they say is basically that it didn't work. So, just to kind of give a brief summary, they put around like booths around the city to do help people with ride sharing and with scheduling buses and paying for things like that. And a lot of that kind of came about as the pandemic did, but only a total of 6 trips were booked through those booths in the entire year. So, obviously that was not a success wanted, and ride sharing lifts in public transit. So for a lot of reasons, this product did not work the way they wanted it to. What smart cities are and kind of what the challenges associated with them are. So you'll see a lot of people, when they think of smart cities, you think of everything being connected. You think of all of this data that links your citizens with how they move about the city and how they interact with city services. And there's a lot of problems associated with that. So that's kind of where we wanted to talk about. I think to start with, the biggest one, obviously the pandemic kind of, cut into that project a lot and changed the way people interact with, the surrounding world. So you can see how, Ubers, Lyfts, ride sharing and stuff like that really was affected by that. But at the same time, my question is, why does the city need to interact with Uber and Lyft? What is the purpose of that? I think one of the problems with smart cities is everyone envisions all of these things being interconnected, but that's not, they're not solving any problems. They're looking to shoehorn in solutions that already exist without actually identifying and, solving any of their problems.
So was that a question, Garrett? Because I can jump in on that if you want. Yeah, so I mean, the biggest thing that I see with entrepreneurs all the time, so this has nothing really to do with smart cities, but it has to do with entrepreneurs and businesses, is they fail to do their development correctly. And the first thing I tell people is you got to focus on your sector development. So, if you're going to go and you have a solution that's going to work for cities, or it's going to work for buses, or it's going to work for cabs, or it's going to work for energy, or it's going to work for, home users or moms or soccer teams or whatever, you got to go talk to those sectors and find out what their pain points are. Once you find out what their pain points are, then you start doing product development. And from there, you try and solve those pain points with product development. Then you start doing customer development to go talk to customers and get them to use the product that solves the problems that you have identified. I think in these particular smart cities, a lot of times there's a couple of points of failure. The biggest one being is that they don't know what problems they're trying to solve. They're trying to solve things, they build things, they kind of build it from that, field of dreams. If you build it, users will come. Sometimes you get lucky with that. That's where you get sometimes just amazingly viral solutions. But more often than not, it's a big failure because you built something that nobody wanted to begin with. And I think that is what Columbus found. They were building things that people wouldn't use, didn't interact with. I don't know that the pandemic was really that big a deal. I mean, if I'm going to call an Uber to pick me up, am I going to walk to a kiosk down the street to do it? I don't think so. It seems like a problem nobody ever had, which is why 6 people only ever used it. And I bet 5 of those probably were like the wives or husbands of people who were on the team, who were like, okay, I'll try out this crazy idea and see if it works. So I don't know. Evan, what do you think?
No, I actually agree very much with what you're saying, especially on the development side. So I have an interesting perspective being a technology guy in a non-technology company, in a non-technology industry, right, in the physical security space. And I think a lot of that ties into this smart cities piece where you're saying, when you're working on development, you want to make sure you have the problem first. But I think that goes into any kind of innovation, not necessarily just development. And my philosophy has always been, being part of a non-technology company, my money is better spent in deployment and partnership than in development, right? There are people who are already developing things. There are people who are very good at that. And so it's better to find the people who are already on that track and invest in that product in a partnership role than try to build it in-house. And so to Garrett's point about, trying to hook up with Uber and Lyft, if this had been the problem, right, if they identified a problem that there was a segment of the population of Columbus who wanted to schedule Ubers and Lyfts but didn't have the phone app or whatever the case may be, right? If that was the problem, then this may have been a good solution. But Kevin, to your point, I don't think that was the problem. They never actually identified the problem. So had they gone through that process of identifying the problem and then either working on the development piece or building that partnership that solved that problem, they would have been much better off.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you just have to go out on a limb. I mean, like sometimes a founder of a company can say, you know what, I have this problem, and I think other people are going to have the same problem too. I mean, look at Google. It started because they wanted to be able to search and find websites on the internet. That was it. And lo and behold, billions of people had the same problem. So, but I doubt they did any research to prove that. So,
well, and to that point, Kevin, look at Amazon. They started off as a bookstore, and now are one of the biggest cloud hosts and employers of robotic technology in their warehouses, and they've completely transformed their business around what people wanted and what people needed, not just what they thought.
I'll jump in there for a second and tell you that that's actually a misnomer. I think Amazon knew books was their first foray, but Jeff, Bezos envisioned selling everything. That was, in fact, if you ever look at the Amazon logo, you guys have probably seen it a billion times. It's got the Amazon logo with that little smile underneath it. If you actually look at that logo, you'll notice that is an arrow going from A to Z because they plan to sell everything from A to Z.
Yep. And they had that, and they built it, and then they've ran with it, and they've structure, which is to Evan's point, like existing technologies and companies, economics of scale come into play. There's no point in reinventing the wheel when there's a company like Google, Apple, Amazon, who's already doing it and doing it well. Especially when it comes to like smart cities, the amount of data you're collecting on your citizens needs to be protected. And you can see how if if you're tracking stoplights, if you're tracking movement of traffic throughout the city, if that information is not anonymized effectively and is not secured well, that's a treasure trove of data for people to look at and to group you into subcategories and say, all right, Kevin, I know, goes to the bar every day at 3 o'clock because he drives back here, and then he sits there until 9 o'clock where he goes to another bar because he doesn't actually want anyone to know that he's drinking. So, like the amount of data you can collect through those kind of metrics is honestly kind of scary in a lot of ways because, I think we've shown with, OPM and a lot of other, the hacks in the last couple of years that large corporations and governments are not the best at securing their data.
Yeah, no, it's a big problem because, I often joke, we can't have nice things because of bad actors. A lot of these technologies are invented with the idea of making life better, and but it does become very slippery slopes. A lot of issues, as you mentioned, with privacy. But then there's some nuggets of gold. I mean, like a murder was solved in Blacksburg because they were able to track the cell phones and then track the cameras through the town and things like that. So it's there are some nuggets of gold with this information. The smart cities have good promise. I think sometimes they're just setting up bad examples of what success is. We were talking a little bit about this last night, and I made the comment. I mean, they started this RFP process something like 5 or 6 years ago. If I made you, Evan, use a cell phone from 6 years ago, you'd be like, why are you giving me this ancient technology? So you figure, our bureaucratic, is the process involved in a city getting involved in these type of things too slow to really work with the highly accelerated rate of technology that we deal with today? I would say they're not the best fit. So.
Yeah. Now, Garrett, I actually had a quick question for you. Like, as someone who has, helped design or implement some smart cities, or at least some aspects of, what a smart city can and should do, what's your idea of a successful smart city?
So my idea of a successful smart city is one that, and this is going to be fairly broad, but one that increases the interaction between the government and its citizens. What I see are people who are using like ArcGIS, softwares to do, a lot of mapping and data planning, and then giving their citizens ways to like submit trouble tickets, for the pothole out in the street. For this is where the stormwater backs up every time it rains and it, floods out the street and it's going to wash away the side. Things like that, where you're able to have all of these kind of, but one at the base level, this demographic data of, these areas, these neighborhoods, and these cities, but then also build on top of that and foster this engagement with your citizens to say, tell us what the problems are so we can solve them. And that way you can, categorize them based on need. You can see that, there's 500 people reporting that this one pothole is terrible. So we need to go fix that first. And then, automatically generating work orders for your streets department and for trash pickup and stuff based on that. So, to me, when it comes to smart cities, that's kind of the starting point. Is we want to foster more cooperation between the citizens and the government and use that to direct resources.
Yeah, I think quality of life, I mean, for me, I think about little simple things like, the DMVs around me, can tell me what the average wait time is and how many people are in line. So I can decide to go to a different branch than the one I was planning to go to, or I can decide to go a different time if it's just, I don't want to wait that long. So there can be so many little simple things that can be gathered, like you said, potholes and trash pickup, that can just really improve the quality of life for people. Traffic, things like that. We've already seen that with Google and Waze and things like that, with these massive sensors that are out there. What can we do with this type of data that improves people's lives and makes their lives easier?
And I think what I've seen, though, is that in a lot of these areas where people aren't used to real-time data, right? Whether it's city government or, non-technology industries or whatever the case may be, like, we are in a time of constant real-time data. Every time you pick up your phone or click on a browser, right, there's all of this data being generated, but these entities have no idea what to do with real-time data. And so, sure, like I remember, like in that city of Columbus RFP, they were talking about having all of these sensors and getting all of this data. But what are you planning to do with it? If you're going to put all these sensors out there with no idea of how you're going to actually act on that data, then you're not going to be, setting yourself up for any kind of success. And so I think, training these cities on what kind of data they need and how they can interact with it is going to be a key piece of this.
Yeah, and how they manage it, how they secure it, and how they dispose of it. That's one of the things a lot of times people like go to these trouble of building these giant data lakes, but then they don't think about, maybe it isn't safe to be keeping that data. What can I do to dispose of it? And how do I dispose of it? And how long do I keep it for? And what can it be used for? I teach an entire class that the class is summed up with one title, and it's called Think Evil. And it's start thinking like bad guys when you're building good systems, because we want the good actors to try and think about what can be done nefariously with this data. There's systems like OptiGreen, for example, that can turn the lights green for ambulances and rescue and the EMS, emergency people and whatnot. But those type of systems, will they be used by bad actors? Probably not. You can get caught pretty easily, but we can't have nice things sometimes because of bad actors. So that's the sad part, but we need to think about that when we're collecting this data. But I don't know, I'll ask a question. So Garrett, what would be the number one thing you'd like to see a smart city provide you?
More visibility into my tax dollars, honestly. I want to know, and not necessarily the budget, but I want to know what their goals are, what they're doing in 10 years, and how they are getting. I want to know that when I submit, like the pothole ticket, for instance, that's going to be responded to, and not based on me, but based on the priorities of the city and of the area. I want to know that the city is listening to me, basically, at the end of the day. I want to know that there's that interaction and that back and forth between my elected officials and myself. That to me is the foundation of kind of the whole smart city, quote unquote movement is. You want to foster this, data collection, but you do that based on a spirit of cooperation. Just like with that, with your phone, you agree to allow data collection through apps, and you do that because you understand that they are using that data to, analyze what you're looking at and to make suggestions. For instance, like on Amazon, you buy something and it's going to say, oh, here's other things like that. And so there are times that you do allow your data to be collected, but there's also times where you don't see the value of that. So you don't. And I'm a big privacy person. I believe in privacy, but I believe it's a choice and it's an opt-in situation. So when it comes to cities, I just want to know, I want to help, and I want to know what they're trying to do and what their goals are to help accomplish them, and just see how they intend to network all of that together. And Kevin, like you said earlier, like you can have these massive data lakes, but if you don't know what you're doing with them and you don't have any way to expose and surface that data, then what good is it?
Evan, what about you? Any thoughts on what you want to see from a smart city? Like what's one thing you think they should do?
Well, I think that the biggest thing for me is a lot like Garrett was saying is, and you said earlier, right? That quality of life aspect. How do we focus on the needs of the specific people who live in that city and make their lives better, make their lives easier? But I think personally, my biggest thing that I would love to see a smart city do is start to move towards probably a blockchain solution that allows me to control my data, but more easily share that data with the city. There's nothing that's more frustrating than having to put the same information into 10 different forms in 10 different places. Like if I go to the Department of Transportation to get my ID, I have to put in all this information. But then if I have to go to the county clerk, I have to put in all the same information to get a certificate or a permit for work on my house or whatever the case may be. All of this information is held in so many disparate systems across the board that getting that interconnectedness, I think, is probably one of the key points, right? Not just having the data, but the interconnection between data. And me being a big blockchain proponent, I think that that's probably the safest and most secure way to allow that interconnection while also giving me the ability to control my data versus for the city to control my data.
Yeah,
and I agree with that.
Good advice,
and and a lot of levels, like you don't want, nothing makes me, more frustrated than information 10 different times to do one or two basic things. Like Evan said, you go to the city clerk's office and they say, all right, you need to go upstairs, 2 more floors to go to the building permits, and you fill out this building permit application. Then you take that, they stamp it, You walk downstairs to the clerk's office, and then you have to fill out this other form so they can file that away and make it official. And you're crisscrossing all of these all of these theoretical boundaries, when in reality it should be one unified, cohesive approach. And I'm not saying that we should have like a federal or state database where my driver's license, for instance, has a like a RFID chip in it that encodes all of my information. I just walk around and scan it. But to Evan's point about the blockchain stuff, there needs to be a way for us to control the data that the city collects on us, and but still allow them to surface good metrics from it and good KPIs so that they can affect change. I think I was in New York City recently. I think one of the big things that always strikes me when I'm in New York is the amount of trash on the streets. So for like a more practical application of kind of a smart city thing, I would want to see the ability to, either through cameras or through and vision systems, or through people reporting it, or through the actual smart garbage cans or something like that, be more proactive and not empty trash, not just do routes around the city emptying every trash can whether it's full or not, but actually help to clean up it more proactively and more real time, like Evan said earlier, about getting those real time analytics and those real time metrics. So
some of that I think falls into, sorry, I thought you were done. I think some of that falls into unintended consequences. So New York City, I think the reason you're seeing so much trash is that trucks are only allowed in from like 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. at night. So everybody puts out their trash when they close their business at 5 o'clock, but it's not picked up for, starting 6 more hours later. Trucks aren't allowed. They aren't even in the city during the day. Additionally, we've seen similar things, like from a smart city standpoint, a very well-designed building that you talk about unintended consequences. So they took a building that had fluorescent lighting on every floor and everything like that, and they went in and they added all these sensors to tell if people were on the floor, and added LED lighting and everything like that. And they were talking about how they were saving all this money and everything like that. And then the very first winter that happened, all the pipes froze in the building because the building was designed with no heat. The fluorescent lights were intended to be kept on 24/7, and they provided the heat load for the building. And so when they switched to LEDs and they started turning off all the lights, nobody remembered that this was the way the building was designed. And people were coming in and going, man, this building's really cold. And then, they come in one cold December morning and the pipes had all frozen because the lights were off overnight. So that's not something I hope that is a big thing. But, I do think we need to have more studies and proof of concepts, and private sector and public sector working together. I think that's where we see this. So, I mean, like you were saying, like, should we work with Uber? Should we work with Lyft? Well, should the government be running their own system? I mean, should they be running their own buses? I mean, I think they've done it because nothing else has existed, but those existing systems are highly inefficient. And I think the smart cities can make them much, much more efficient. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would also, I would agree with that the existing systems can be inefficient, but I also feel like there have been some really good innovations that have come out of this, simply because some cities have been able to ask the right questions and have been open to that innovation. I'm aware of a project in Atlanta where they wanted to get better traffic data. And traditional traffic counting and vehicle counting systems are they're very bandwidth intensive, especially if you're trying to use any kind of computer vision. The data is not autonomized, like Garrett mentioned earlier, right? So I know that this off by using computer vision, but just using the metadata, not actually transferring any of the video itself, just the metadata pulled off of the video analytics, which I think is going to be something that we're going to see a lot more of, right? Whether it's using the laser point instead of actual cameras, or using just the metadata from the cameras and pulling that, so that you're able to do things that consume much less bandwidth in much smaller area or in much larger areas. You're able to pull all of this real-time data and then get better interaction with it, which I thought was a very interesting application to the city, where they're able to use this on a very broad scale in Atlanta, where traffic is just horrendous. And they're able to deploy this on all of their major highways and get all of this real-time data, but they don't have to worry about what data they're holding, or how long to keep it, or how much bandwidth they need. in all of these places because they're able to do it over cellular, and it's autonomized and it's real time. So,
well, I think to your point, Evan, like one of the things, like I'm typically a very big believer in collecting all of the data that you can and then figuring out what to do with it later. But from the government's perspective, you don't want to, you need to. So like what you just said about using lasers, versus using cameras for that kind of stuff. One, it's a much lighter weight from a bandwidth and computational standpoint, and two, it's still giving you the data that you need without risking people's privacy. And I think it really needs to, especially when it comes to smart cities, be cognizant of people's privacy and start from that standpoint and work forward. So, I think a lot of that kind of comes down to, the kind of a lot of the shift towards edge computing and doing a lot of that stuff at the edge instead of, in the cloud and some big server where you've got the bandwidth restrictions and the compute stuff like Evan just mentioned. I think there's a lot to be said for simple metrics that then can be extrapolated into powerful data and not using, using the right tool for the right thing where, like for the traffic, the laser definitely is better than computer vision. Yeah, computer vision can solve that problem, but that adds a multitude of other problems, the storage, the bandwidth, the compute, and the cloud costs, among other things. So, and, the privacy and the security of it, where the laser, who really cares? It's just counting. It's just a sequenced, serialized number. So, I think that's something that we need to be cognizant of when it comes to designing systems like this is how do we protect, our citizens, but also how do we do that and affect, good change efficiently.
Yeah, because smart cities aren't really smart. They just have a lot of data, but they don't have intelligence about how that data is used or misused. So, I mean, it sounds loud and clear to me that you guys, the biggest threat you see to smart cities being effective is privacy and the security of the data. So, kind of interesting. I wouldn't have predicted that, but I certainly am very balanced on what I use. I'm very slow to uptick on certain technologies. I see the benefit of it, but I also see the negative sides of it. Little things like, Google telling you things like, hey, you open this file every Monday at 10 a.m. and suggesting you open it. Or like if you have a Tesla and it reads your Google Calendar, it can start your car 10 minutes early and put the air conditioning on so it's ready to go in a nice temperature and things like that. I see the benefits, but it's also like now I have a vehicle that knows my exact route and things like that. And maybe nobody cares about me, but what about, the first time something like that is used to harm somebody or is used to send somebody off a cliff or something like that. I think it'll be a very interesting discussion point. So
yeah, I always think about that there's a scene when Michael's following his GPS and he drives right into a lake because he's trusting the technology to that it knows better than he does, and and he's trusting that it's not a malicious actor. And I think that that's something to your point, Kevin, that we need to just be cognizant of. So it's not technology is not the solution to every problem. There are people problems that are not solvable always through technology. So it's counterbalance.
I actually had a quick question for Kevin. So you just mentioned that smart cities aren't really smart; they just generate a lot of data. What's your feel on applications of a lot of the new AI tech and applying some of these different AI applications into this giant data lake of a smart city and trying to do some of the things that you're talking about? What are your thoughts there?
Well, you threw me a little bit of a softball question there. So I've been doing artificial intelligence now for 23 years, roughly. And the thing I normally start off with is just kind of defining what is artificial intelligence. And anti-spam is probably the best example that most people have that they really understand artificial intelligence. So the first thing you start off with any artificial intelligence is you start off with data analytics. That has to do with even somebody sitting down with a pad of paper or graph paper or a spreadsheet, and they collect data. Then they come up with a hypothesis and they look at the data and see whether or not it proves that information. The next step after doing data analytics, whether by computer or manually, is you build a machine learning model based on that information. In anti-spam, one of the most common ones is naive Bayesian tokens, where the systems can take a known set of data of good and bad email and compare a new incoming email and say which set it fits in. And by doing that, it can then classify it as good email or bad email. And artificial intelligence, what I think most people miss, is solely the action, the performing of an action based on machine learning, based on data analytics. So for example, when the email comes in and it's classified as spam or good email, and your system decides whether to put it in your inbox or your junk folder, that is artificial intelligence. But everything else is built on the rest of that data and what's in the hypothesis and what's in the systems there. There's also a whole debate on what's called true AI, which is when the computers can build their own models. We're not quite at that level of computing power with AI yet. I think we're very close, especially with certain things. But what I want to see is more ability for people to look at that data, find out how they can solve problems, posit out situations about what they can make easier, and try and just make things simpler. I mean, I've said it for years. There's a lot of burden that's on business owners. So as a business owner, I know, for example, I think the I-9 verification system is one of the dumbest systems in the planet. Am I qualified to look at an ID and tell you if it's fake or not? No. So why are we putting that burden on companies? There should be a government that just simply comes back and I can type in a thing and it says, yes, that's good, or yes, that's bad. And I think about all the time that's spent on that and similar things. And, you think about taxes and things like that. How many, countless thousands and tens of thousands of hours are wasted on individual companies, let alone individual people probably spend, 10, 20, 30, or 100 hours a year on dealing with taxes. I would think by this point, we've got the computing power to come back and say, here's the exact amount of money you owe, and do it calculated on a paycheck by paycheck basis rather than, this crazy, system that we have now. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for computers to get involved and look at what we're saving time. We need to start tracking a little bit more about like what people are spending time on. It's easy to say we spend a lot of time in the car, we spend a lot of time at work, we spend a lot of time on forms and paperwork and taxes. Those seem to be the things that we should be using to try and make easy, because by now I thought we'd be living in a Jetsons world or a Star Trek world where, robots took care of all that stuff for us and we could go off and do the fun things we like doing. So, all right, I put my soapbox away. I think I answered your question, but if I didn't, I apologize.
I agree 100%, right? When we start talking about smart cities and AI and being able to take the mundane out of life and replace it with things that we want to do, I think that I'm right there on board with you. And there are some really great smart city applications, again, utilizing blockchain or other technologies that I've done some research on. A lot of these are in Europe, so a few more like progressive cities, overseas, where they've been able to apply some of those things, and the government says, "Hey, like we already know what you make, we already know what business you own, and so we can just do all of your taxes with a click of a button. Here it is, and it's done." Now, obviously, like the complexity of the tax code and things like that make that a little more difficult here, but definitely not impossible. And I think that's something that could be really effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I belong to an organization called the Government Blockchain Association. It's G as in government, B as in blockchain, A association, global.org. Wonderful organization, really looking at trying to bring stuff. And especially like for anybody who's listening here that isn't really familiar with the technology, don't think of blockchain as just cryptocurrency. Think of blockchain as a distributed ledger technology. And it's basically the next evolution of double entry bookkeeping and how to do that with great transparency, great veracity, so that, basically these ledgers are extremely accurate and extremely verifiable. And that's probably the biggest thing that blockchain really gives to us right now to change so many of these great technologies and utilize them. So I agree completely. And, it's nice to hear that some of the places in Europe are doing my idea. They'll have to give me credit for it. So.
Well, and then even looking at things like, we're talking about all the way back to the very beginning when we were talking about the Columbus issue and looking at transportation. I think that they probably would have been better served to come up with maybe even just a like better data on the current transportation they had, and then applying that data. Like, for example, if they know that every day the number 12 bus is 4 minutes late to the bus stop off of whatever street it is, right? And they know that it's late every day, then being able to have that available to the people who want to catch that bus is going to be helpful. We're talking about quality of life, or just being able to pull up the buses in real time, right? Here, let me show me a map of Columbus and where the buses are and when they're going to be at the stop. This bus will be at this stop in 5 minutes, right? And then it becomes much easier to maybe, set up a trip. Hey, I'm at my office. I want to go, 10 blocks over, and I don't want to walk. I want to take the cheaper public transportation and not take an Uber. Pull up a map, and you can say, oh, there's a bus down the street. It'll be at this stop in 3 minutes. I can make it there, and I go up 2 stops, and I'm done. Right. And because you have all of that real-time data of where the buses are and where they stop and when they stop, you're able to do all of that in a much more comprehensive way that puts the data in the hand of the user to make those decisions, instead of trying this convoluted way of trying, like Garrett said, trying to shoehorn some of these other, private sector type applications in.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, it's quality of life stuff. And, like Kevin, you said a while back, talking about like ways and these kind of crowdsourcing ways of doing this, pulling this data together. To your point, Evan, the bus coming down the street, like that's very useful, especially if you can integrate it into your Apple Maps, your Google Maps, or your Waze, whatever transit application you're using. And, again, to your earlier point too, it's not just about having the data, it's about integrating it together and having it cohesively useful. So, being able to have the city, as for instance, like partner with Waze or with Google or with Apple Maps to, incorporate the data that they have from their public transit systems into, the apps that people are already using. I think there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah, data location, all that type of data. I mean, it's, there's certain things I'm not sure. I mean, like anybody here orders stuff from Amazon, it's always like, Amazon's, 8 stops away from you. And I'm like, okay, I don't know that I needed that granularity of data, but, I guess, somebody needed it at some point. I think there are some certain things that would be a lot better, served and whatnot, power grid, water, things like, hey, think about, the pandemic, trying to find hand sanitizer. It'd be nice if there was a way to, kind of, tell people where those kind of things were available. That's a really, really very pinpointed item as well. But I've also just seen how mapping, data location has just really changed how almost everything in the world is done. And so, you're absolutely correct. So, I know you don't hear that much. You're stunned, but.
Well, I know, I think that like ArcGIS and, a lot of the stuff that they're doing with that, is really interesting there, because it does give you this way of looking at, your whole city or your state or your county and building on top of it all of these layers of data, but still being able to correlate it down, up and down the chain. And, and again, that's, to me, what's important is that correlation, because that's, that's your power. You don't want, and nothing's more frustrating than having like an ERP or any kind of, resource planning, RMS system where connect and you have to then jump over to this module to modify it over here, and then over the place when it would be in one place, or at least tied together.
Yeah, I try and make sure that as an engineer, I don't fall into that trap too much. I mean, there's people that are very famous, like Steve Jobs, for, being angry with engineers, what part of one button don't you understand kind of thing. And I'm, especially in my younger days, I was more like, it takes only 42 steps. What's the problem? It's easy. So yeah, we need to make it easier for people who don't want to or enjoy technology. It just has to be one button, and it just has to work and solve people's problems. And like you said, it has to continue making their life easier and improve their quality of life. So right. I don't know, it comes back to, again, what's something that would improve your quality of life? Evan, do you have any more thoughts?
Well, no, I think the biggest thing there is when we're looking at especially some of these smaller governments, right? Where you can talk about the entire state, you can talk about your county. Let's talk about like the small local government. They want the people who work in local government want to be able to provide resources to the people who live there. Right? There's no other reason to be in local government unless you actually want to help the people who live there. And I feel like there are so many people who work in local government that are frustrated because they have to jump through all of these hoops. There's all of this red tape. There's all of this bureaucracy that prohibits them from providing the services that they really want to be able to provide. And I think that the technology is best served put in their hands, Kevin, just like you said, to increase quality of life for the people who are there by making it easy. Let's make this push button simple. Let's get rid of some of these extra steps that have kind of been the norm for so long, and let's try to attack this old problem in a new way so that we can get these services to people who need them more rapidly, that we can be more efficient, that we can, that we know where the money is going and how it's going and why, so that we're not finding out through some kind of newspaper audit 5 years down the road that, oh, like, this was happening over here, the money wasn't ever actually getting to the people who need it. All of this stuff can be simplified by applying the technology in ways that do that. And I think that that's focusing on these problems and not necessarily focusing on what someone thinks is cool who's responding to an RFP.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I look at the disruptive technology. I mean, we mentioned some of it, Google, Amazon. I think about things like Craigslist. They solved a problem people had, and this is why these technologies became so huge. And other things like FreeCycle that I love as well. It's a really great technology. Cell phones, I mean, probably one of the biggest adopted technologies in my lifetime has probably been cell phones, especially smartphones. And just to simply have a camera with you and have a calendar and be able to make phone calls and send an email has changed the way many people out of business and in business do their lives. And the camera thing, for example, I think about how many issues and whatnot have come to light because people have been able to pull out a camera and record it. And there's an old joke in the photography industry of, what's the best camera to own or what's the best camera to have, kind of thing. And the answer is always the one you have with you. So, you think about, some of the most famous iconic photographs that are out there. They weren't taken with expensive equipment. I mean, they were taken, oftentimes with amateur level equipment, shaky cams, barely can see any data on it, et cetera, but it changed the course of history. So, I think about what kind of things can we do in a smart city that really changes the course of history and improves people's lives. So
I agree. And I think, to your point, Kevin, it's about what you already, it's about using what you have with you and what's available. So, like one of the things I think about from a smart city standpoint is, like you're in, the city trying to cross the street, you hit the button, that sets up the timer for the light. So you can, it increases the time on the light so you can walk across, safely. It wouldn't be, a big stretch to imagine how you would link those together and just get the data on how often it's being pushed and, what it's doing so that you can then, proactively adjust the timing. A simple binary collection that then get, the ability to affect a lot with it.
No, absolutely. Well, I know you worked in local government for a long time. What's the biggest thing that you think local governments could implement in a smart city standpoint that would help the citizens?
I mean, I think, kind of what we talked about earlier was just like the help desk system, basically. I think that's something that some cities have, but aren't, fully, a lot of cities, especially in West Virginia, don't. And, I think that alone, will create a much more like cooperative, agreement, cooperative society, between the citizens and their government and their elected officials. I think that anything we can do to foster that, coordination and communication is great. I think that's something that's approachable, and that's something that is a good first step so that citizens can see their government reaching out through this technology and trying to, interact with them and them being able to interact with their elected officials.
No, I agree completely. And I know the cybersecurity wonk in me wants to see things like kind of like a 911 for cybersecurity issues for businesses and private citizens to call, because, it needs to be in the hand of experts, and it needs to be tracked, and you need to see specific trends and things like that. And help desk is a great way to do that, because you can start to track where problems are at, where things aren't getting fixed, where the volume of the complaints are coming from, et cetera, to try and, have it be effective change for the people that are there. So I guess I'll ask another question. So, if they came to your city and wanted to do a bid for smart cities, would you support it? Would you think it was wasted tax dollars? What would you do? Evan, I'll ask you since Garrett talked last.
My answer is probably really simple. It depends. It depends on what problem they're going to solve. I think that I am 100% for smart cities. I think that that's the only way that we're going to progress, that we're going to take this thing to the next level. But some of that also depends on what infrastructure is already in place, right? We can't just automatically jump right into smart cities. Sometimes you have to take steps in this. So in some of your more rural areas where there may be bandwidth issues, hey, let's put the smart city on hold and let's just get fiber into the town first. Trying to set up what this will look like in 3, 5, 10 years, so that we're able to leverage all of this. And 5G may render some of those issues moot at some point, but we're not there yet. So I think the simple answer is it depends. The more complicated answer is yes, we have to get there, and how we get there is going to be important. But we need to make sure we're taking the right steps to, like your original point, making sure that things are secure, because I'm not confident in local governments to keep anything secure right now on the cybersecurity front, let alone private businesses. But then on top of that, what infrastructure do we need to be in place? And then finally, we can get into what questions are we going to answer, what issues are we going to solve for the people who live there with some of these smart city applications.
Any thoughts, Garrett?
I mean, I completely agree. I don't think that the smart city thing is a one size fits all template. I think to Evan's point, it's about using what you already have and, efficiently. And so that, I absolutely support those kind of RFPs, but I also think that they need to be very well tailored for the specifics of each location and each municipality and each, local government. And, that's where I think everyone just thinks smart city and they hear this, kind of buzzword, but they don't actually think about how that applies specifically to them. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely support it, but again, it comes down to the specifics.
Yeah. So for the Columbus, Ohio, so would you categorize it as a failure?
I would categorize it as not a failure, honestly. I think, one of a couple things, $50 million over 5 years for a city the size of Columbus isn't enough money to fully implement anything like that at that size and that scope. So to me, it was structured more as a test and as a proving ground. And, I come from a science background where as long as you have data, it's a good thing. There's no failed experiments as long as you get good data out of it. So, they've learned, I think, from that RFP and their response to it, what didn't work, which, would then make the next one hopefully more effective. And, to your point earlier about, the RFP was 6 years ago in 2015 when they responded to it. I think that this stuff changes so quickly that, the time scale really needs to be more compressed and, potentially more front loaded with budget. I think that program wasn't necessarily designed. I think it was the first of its kind, really. And, I think a lot was learned from it. So no, I would not categorize it as a failure, but I also wouldn't categorize it as, a successful smart city deployment.
I'm not sure how to not successful, but good data. Or, it's maybe like the light bulb. You learn 999 ways not to make a light bulb, kind of thing. So
yeah,
famous book.
I think it's also has to do a lot with the application, right? So like Garrett said, 5 years, $50 million to implement this whole big scope. They would have been better off taking the 50 and, focusing on one aspect of it. Hey, just focus on the trucks, or just focus on this, or they tried to do too much. So I think they kind of overestimated what they could do, and I think honing, like we said at the very beginning, honing the initial question of what problems they were going to solve would have gone a long way to make this more successful.
Yeah, and thinking about the quality of life and some of the things I heard one story from a customer a few weeks ago where they implemented a GPS tracking system, a cell phone cradle that had to be used, and front and rear cameras on their entire fleet of air conditioning repair system trucks. And it was very interesting because they talked about how drivers started getting lost less. They had less safety issues, and when there were issues, they were able to definitively point out who was at fault in the accidents. It didn't always work in the company's favor, but it was interesting because before that, like say for example, Garrett, gets in an accident. What they would do is they would take Garrett off of driving for 2 weeks. They would have an investigation into it. It would go through a very rigorous process. Now it's like they review the tapes and they can go and say, Garrett, you were not at fault, or Garrett, you screwed up. We're going to send you to driver training. But that can be fixed very rapidly, and kind of figure out what the problem is, what the cause is, and I think that does support Garrett's idea. Sometimes just knowing what your problems is half the challenge. So. All right. Well, I think we are being told to finish up, but
any kind of questions, from the audience? If not, kind of any final statements from Kevin or Evan?
I'll give it to Evan first.
Yeah, no, just I think that this is the future. This is where we're heading. We're going to be applying these smart city buzzwords for a long time as we find new ways to build data and use data. And it's just about a matter of taking that data and trying to democratize it and put it in the hands of the people so that the city can actually provide better services.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only thing I'll leave it with is the question of whether or not Garrett looks like the logo from Ghostbusters with the logo behind him. I think that's what we need to. No, I got nothing here. Thank you guys so much for having me on here. It's fun to talk about these things. I love using technology and trying to solve problems, and look forward to seeing what the next evolution is. And thanks for having me.
Yep. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you, guys. It was a really interesting conversation to listen to from my point of view. Thanks. It was great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah.